Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together some of the UK's leading commentators, BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents writing, blogging and broadcasting to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, a taxing question for the G20 making multinationals pay their fair share. And is the head of the IMF naming and shaming the G7 over vaccination? To discuss that, I'm joined by Geoffrey Kaufman, who was a news anchor in both his native Canada and the United States, as well as a much-travelled foreign correspondent. Isabel Hilton, newspaper columnist and broadcaster, who founded China Dialogue, an independent organisation trying to foster greater understanding of China and to improve its environment. And you see him there, our BBC business editor, Simon Jack, who's with me in the studio. Good to have you with me, Simon. And welcome to Isabel and to Geoffrey. Lovely to see you again from distant parts. Now, no taxation without representation, the slogan of the American colonies after a sales tax was imposed on them by the British Parliament, where they had no elected voice. The companies will end up paying more tax as a result of the global corporate tax deal on the agenda for the finance ministers of the countries which form the G20, meeting in Venice this weekend, may lack representation, but they have had the money to fund a skilled lobbying operation to try to influence the shape of this reform. You may not feel much sympathy for them or indeed for Caribbean tax havens, but should we be more concerned about the impact on the poorer nations? Simon, first of all, can you explain to me exactly what this proposed deal is?
OK, there are two parts to this, two so-called pillars. The first one are new rules to force companies to pay taxes on the sales and profits they generate in the countries in which they operate, even if they don't have physical operations there. Now, this is clearly targeted at the digital services companies, the Googles of this world, who basically make enormous amounts of profit and sales in countries where they don't necessarily have a massive physical presence. That's part one. Part two is a global minimum tax rate, which was agreed at the G7 and has been ratified, I think, at the G20, of at least 15%. US and France would like to see it higher. Other countries would like to see it lower, but at least 15%. And what that would do is reduce the incentive for companies to shift profits around the world to low tax jurisdictions where they can basically deprive what people see of their native countries, if you like, and tax revenue, which is being, if you like, in the tax equivalent of outer space. There was a particular Apple arrangement where they had a subsidiary which wasn't resident for tax purposes in any country on the world. So that's why I say it's the tax equivalent of outer space. That's since been changed, and let's hope there's real consensus for this change. We've been talking about this for years. Two things happened: Biden and COVID. Biden is a fan of these proposals where Donald Trump wasn't, and COVID, you've got exchequers around the world who have been cleared out by COVID and need some way to fill them back up again.
Thank you for that. Very clear explanation. Isabel, does it, in your judgment, pass the fairness test on a global basis?
Well, I don't think that this particular set of arrangements will pass the fairness test in the sense of greatly benefiting poor countries. But I think that's not entirely what it was designed to do. And after all, you know, G20, the countries of G20 account for more than 80% of global GDP. So we're already in a monstrously unfair situation. I think what poorer countries might hope for is that if greater tax revenues can be harvested by the richer countries from the multinationals, that might make richer countries more generous towards the poorer countries, which they certainly need to be. But as Simon said, you know, there are two aspects to this, and both have been criticised. The tax rate, because it's relatively low, and certainly I think President Biden would have liked it to be higher, but has a very limited chance of getting it through Congress against Republican opposition. But the second problem is that for the taxation for operations would be on a tax rate where the profit margin is more than 10%. So, you know, I can see the tax lawyers of the multinationals rubbing their hands and getting to work on new strategies for evading it. So I think it's not necessarily the great miracle that Rishi Sunak proposed it to be, but we shall see. I mean, I think everyone agrees that these corporations need to pay tax. They need to pay more tax, partly because they're destroying businesses in other countries that do pay tax. So there's a kind of double whammy. But whether this is really going to deliver, we'll see.
I'm sure those lawyers would probably characterise it as tax avoidance rather than evasion. But in terms of the statistics, Jeffrey, I mean, around a third of the profits of US multinationals were listed for tax purposes in 3 countries, Ireland, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, which, surprise, surprise, have comparatively low corporate tax rates, but which only accounted for what, I think it was 5% of that, 15% of their sales, maximum, 2018 figures. Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, must be rubbing her hands with glee at the prospect of this.
This is an early victory for her, for sure. She is respected and a seasoned diplomat in the financial world, and this is something that she very much wanted. This is something, it really represents the shift from the Trump White House to the Biden White House. And it does, as was mentioned earlier, reflect the new realities of the global economy. Governments need more money. And we are all aware of these stories of Amazon and Apple and Starbucks sending their money to places where they're not doing business, where they can pay lower taxes. Places like Panama and Bermuda, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Ireland. And it's really, yes, of course, it's tax avoidance as Isabel notes, on a technical level. But to us as consumers, to us as taxpayers who see the high streets here in the UK and main streets in the US and elsewhere closing down their shops because Amazon has taken the business away, this is revenue that's being lost. And the taxation goes with those closing shops. They need to recover it. It needs to come back in real dollars that can be sent to support government infrastructure, government operations, and building a future.
Simon, how does this, in terms of the implementation, deal with something that all treasuries rely on, which is exemptions, often created as incentives to encourage companies to locate in a particular part of the country, and we do a lot of it in the UK, or indeed invest but make new research investment. Presumably the exemptions bit is still not to be negotiated, and that's the fine detail. Is that where this could all kind of end up being not as substantial as they hope?
Well, I think it could get messy in a number of different ways. The first is it looks like we are getting towards an exemption for financial services. Take a bank like HSBC, headquartered in the UK, in London, does most of its business in Asia. Now, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak was very worried that, hang on a second, I've got this big, massive bank and I'm not going to get any tax out of it. I need an exemption. And actually, there is an argument that those subsidiaries which are in other countries are capitalised, are regulated over there, they have a physical presence, and maybe that, so there should be an exemption for that. I think the messy bit is actually going to be when you take a company like Amazon, its retail arm, the reason it's destroying, as Jeffrey says, businesses on high streets and Main Street is because its profit margins are almost zero in its retail business. So how are you going to attack that? Now, there is talk about trying to find the profitable bits of Amazon for its web services, its kind of cloud computing bit, makes an astonishing amount of money, is almost the most, easily the most profitable bit of Amazon. And there's talk about trying to tax that separately. Well, where does that end? If you decide, because every company has lots of subsidiaries, are you going to say, I like this one, this one, this one, this one, but I'm not going to count that one? I think that is going to get very, very messy indeed. And talking to tax lawyers, which I do, boringly enough, on quite a regular basis, I said, is this going to put the big four, for example, the accountancy firms, out of business in their aggressive tax planning where they move their pieces on the global map? He said, oh no, this is going to be a bonanza for them because it gives them a whole new set of rules to tuck into and advise their clients.
Isabel, I said that people might not feel much sympathy for places like Bermuda and Panama, but they have actually signed up to this deal, and they've said however much, it's the end of, the good times from their point of view. Is there any sense, do you think, of a moral obligation on other parts of the world to say, actually, these countries are going to go through quite a traumatic, potentially, adjustment? One might be to a more attractive way of doing business, but one that might have consequences in the short term.
That's, I guess, again, it remains to be seen how traumatic it is. I suspect, like the tax lawyers, the tax havens won't be quite as badly hit as you might perhaps hope that they should be if this is really to work. Every tax haven is a little bit different, and it's not just a low corporate tax that they offer. They some of them offer zero personal income tax, zero inheritance tax, and a whole range of benefits, including secrecy, that are attractive to businesses. And I suspect that they will continue to proffer these services, and clients will continue to find them useful. They didn't exist for nothing. And I don't think this one measure is going to do away with them. And then you've got countries like Ireland, where 1 in 8 people is employed by these giant, particularly the digital firms. And I think that they won't leave Ireland just because they don't have a low tax regime. After all, if there's a uniform tax regime, there's no particular advantage in relocating, and they are pretty much embedded. So conditions will vary depending on the arrangements countries have put in place.
Geoffrey, do you think the kind of modern-day descendants of the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 will actually vote to endorse this?
Well, this is the question. This has to be ratified by each country. And of course, if the U.S. doesn't actually ratify it, then there's a big problem. Biden, as we know, has a split Senate and a razor-thin majority in the House. He's got to get it passed. Republicans, it's really interesting, the cultural divide that this represents. Biden and the Democrats argue this is about investing in infrastructure and education in a clean clean environment. Republicans say that is not how you get growth. You do not tax corporations to do it. You give corporations more money so they can invest. And this is the dichotomy within American politics when it comes to finances, when it comes to financial policy. And they've got to win. Biden has to win, particularly in the Senate. He's got to get 2/3 support to get this through. So he's going to have to find and persuade a whole bunch of Republican senators who are somewhat more moderate than their brethren in the House to support this. It's going to be tough. Watch this channel because the outcome is far from clear.
Simon, last one. I mean, you briefly lived in a tax haven, didn't you?
Very briefly. Very briefly.
Do you think a country like that can survive?
Listen, as Isabel points out, there's all sorts of other wheezes to be had out there. For example, the super rich will still find, individuals will still find these places jolly useful, I imagine. But I just want to pick up on what Geoffrey said. I think that what we should remember is everyone's saying isn't it great, we're going to get lots more tax revenue in all these other countries, because we're mainly talking about these US super companies, aren't we? And actually, the big winner on this is going to be the United States. And actually, it's always been the case when we've ever had this debate that basically US presidents, whoever they are, saying, listen, buddy, if anyone's going to tax these companies, it's going to be us. And I think that actually they will get most of the tax revenue, because it'll make no sense if you've got your brains trust in California to have all these outposts in far-flung places in tax havens around the world. So I think the US is going to be the big winner. But the point is correct that the ability to set your own tax rates is considered quite a big part of sovereignty. So expect that
to keep coming up. Thank you all very much. Now, it's less than a month since the leaders of the G7, a self-selecting club of rich nations meeting on a windswept English peninsula, declared they would end the pandemic by getting as many safe vaccines to as many people as possible, as fast as possible. This week, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, in effect, told them they were being too mean and too slow. Kristalina Georgieva said the richest nations must do more to help the poorest cope with what she called the devastating double blow of pandemic and the consequent economic damage. In effect, she said the price the G7 had balked at paying would be cheap at half the price. Isabel, what do you make of this intervention? It does, by the look of it and the timing just before the meeting of the G20 finance ministers, suggest a pretty stinging rebuke of the speed and the enthusiasm the biggest nations have shown for tackling the kind of disparity created by this pandemic.
Well, indeed. And I have to say it's hard to disagree. And to be fair, it was said at the time of the G7 promise. And it was pretty unedifying to see the world's 7, extremely wealthy countries promising to end a pandemic with an offer of approximately a tenth of what is required. That's according to the WHO. The WHO says we need about 11 billion doses for the rest of the world, and they collectively offered rather less than 1 billion. It's really not good enough. And it was a pattern of honestly of lack of solidarity that just ran through that summit and has been pretty much in evidence for 18 months. It was very much the same on the climate finance pledge, which was also on the table at the G7 summit. And that's a pledge of 100 billion a year, which has been on the table since the Copenhagen summit in 2008, has never been fulfilled, is still not fulfilled. And that will again come up in the G20. And these things matter, not just because it looks mean and ungenerous, which is certainly unattractive, but it matters because, we live in a connected world. And if countries are being pushed into crisis and into, further, in the pandemic case, we'll be breeding new variants, which will come back to us, as we ought to have learned by now. And if they're being pushed into a deeper financial crisis, it's going to generate instability and crises, which in the end the developed world has to deal with. On climate, again, you could wreck the Glasgow COP by failing to honour the promises to the poorer world, because we need everybody to put their shoulders to the wheel in Glasgow. So this is utterly self-defeating. We really ought to we ought to deliver on the promises, and vaccines are up there as a very conspicuous promise. There's a whole queue of other promises behind them.
Jeffrey, Joe Biden said America would be the arsenal of vaccination. Does he just not want to spend the money for this? Because he's investing hugely within the United States. Isn't there also an opportunity, given that the IMF managing director is saying there would be trillions in extra global economic benefit, if only the countries who have the money were spending it in a very short period of time to get the vaccine out there?
Sean, it is important to note that just today, the IMF approved $650 billion towards this effort, which is a significant step that has been stalled, and it does move things forward. But you're right. I mean, the U.S. is sending, I think it's 1 million vaccines to Indonesia. That is just a staggeringly small amount for a country that is being ravaged by COVID. And to give you a sense of the numbers here, the global population is estimated to be about 7.98 billion people. Take about a quarter of that as children. You still have 6 billion adults. Only each needing 2 vaccines until the Johnson & Johnson vaccine can be spread around the world, at least. We only have about 3 billion vaccines delivered, and most of them to the first world. If you look at India, only 5% of the adult population has had 2 vaccines. So we do have a looming catastrophe. We have this very, very worrisome recovery happening, where you see the U.S. economy rebounding better than it has in decades. 7% growth anticipated this year. That's fantastic, right? Well, it's what's called a K-shaped recovery. You're seeing the Western economies going up, and you're seeing the developing and emerging economies going down. And the separation that Isabel's talked about between the wealthy nations and the poorer nations is going to be exacerbated by this pandemic. But it does also have this challenge of it really can come back and bite the Western nations, because these variants are out there. If we don't control this virus and its variants before it continues to reproduce and change, we are going to be in trouble for a very long time globally. So there really is a huge impetus to invest in this. It's not happening fast enough. We are seeing some acceleration, but yes, this is still unacceptable.
It's something of a moral challenge as well to the British Prime Minister, isn't it, Simon? I mean, here he chaired the G7 summit. He was the driving force of getting that communique. He is simultaneously saying in this country, look, the fact we've got vaccination allows us to have this kind of almost bonfire of the COVID regulations on 19th of July. We'll know for certain come Monday when they make the final decision. I mean, in a sense, there's a danger, and there's a sort of I'm all right, Jack approach to this.
I think it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because some governments will tell you the first duty of an elected government is the safety of their own citizens, whether that's in defence or in a situation like this. I think, and the UK government has painted itself into a bit of a corner with its vaccine strategy recently, with lifting all these, because it is relying 100% really. Social distancing is kind of going out, which means it's relying on the strut of the vaccine to do the donkey work in keeping the country safe. So that makes it in a rather difficult position to start contributing vaccines, because you've actually put all your bets on the vaccine keeping this country safe. Now, the UK pledged 100 million doses. I think 5 million go out in September. And I think in government circles, they think actually the UK's kind of done its bit here. They funded a lot of the AstraZeneca research. They put 100 million on the table. And as I say, given this the direction of travel with the restrictions and social distancing on the way out, vaccines are definitely going to be there to support, which I think probably ties their hands a little bit in the generosity they can make. But as you rightly say, and as Jeffrey and Isabel said, this is a pandemic. If you don't do it it comes back to you, right? So, unless you vaccinate everywhere, you vaccinate nowhere in some sense.
Let me ask each of you then, kind of how will you respond personally when the measures are lifted? Simon,
I will continue to wear a mask on public transport and in crowded situations, and I think that that just seems, and that won't feel like, oh my gosh, goodness me, isn't life so weird? I think we've all got used to some new protocols, and remember when we used to look a little bit puzzled when Asian travellers would get off at the airport and say, what the hell are they doing? Yeah. Now we think, oh, that's pretty sad. That was SARS, and that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, interesting change. Jeffrey, how will you respond?
I completely agree. I think that removing masks in public transport at Wembley Stadium, it's crazy. We're setting ourselves up for yet another 180 from the government. I think Boris Johnson understandably wants to move the economy forward. We cannot be in suspended animation perpetually, but a somewhat more incremental approach might be wise here. Isabel,
your situation is slightly different because you're in Scotland at the moment.
No, actually, I'm in London.
Forgive me, you were last time.
Scotland's not doing terribly well in terms of numbers. I too will continue to wear a mask, and look, none of these decisions at a government level are easy, and clearly there are a lot of sectors of the economy that are hurting. None of them are negatively affected by mask wearing. Mask wearing, the removal of the obligation, is entirely politics, and I have very little sympathy for that.
Right.
So I will continue to wear one.
Thank you very much. Now, it's a chance, just before we go, we've got a minute or so each to just talk about something that you think perhaps we haven't paid enough attention to, but you think we ought to keep it in our minds at the moment. Jeffrey, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. As an expatriated Canadian, I haven't lived in Canada for a quarter century. I've just been mortified by these reports of the unmarked Indigenous graves found in the residential schools across Canada. No doubt you've heard about that over the last number of weeks. Canadians are so proud of their goodness, and this is just not something that is easy to stomach. In the wake of that, a really interesting piece of news this week that is kind of tangential, but also really important. Mary Simon, appointed Canada's first Indigenous Governor General, grew up in an Inuit community in northern Quebec, and she is now going to be really the vice-regal representative, the Queen's representative, and really Canada's head of state in essence. And that is symbolically really, usually symbolism in that role, because it's just a symbolic role, doesn't matter. But in this role, it is really fascinating. One caveat, though, she is bilingual. She speaks Inuktitut and English. She does not speak French, which is the other official language of Canada. And so that sets up a bit of a problem for Justin Trudeau. But given what's happened recently, Canadians seem disposed to say it is a good move.
Yeah, and I noticed she's promised she's going to try and learn as quickly as she can. Isabel?
I've been fascinated and will continue to be by the impact of the withdrawal of NATO forces from Afghanistan on China. A short border, but very big interests, including one of the world's biggest copper deposits, which China bought 10 years ago, has never been able to develop. So there are minerals, including rare earths, that China would like to have. The other big thing is security. And watching China make friends with the Taliban has been really interesting, because it's hoping that with Taliban support, it can continue to secure, as they would put it, Xinjiang, but also to try to defend against attacks on an energy pipeline that goes from Western China down to Gwadar in Pakistan, which runs through some very hostile territory. So we're watching China develop into a security actor well beyond its borders. And I think that's going to be well worth watching.
Interesting to see how a Taliban government, if there were one in Kabul, would make friends with a government that is so heavily criticised for its treatment of its minority Muslim community, the Uyghurs. Simon, finally, briefly.
How long have I got?
Oh, I think you've got about just under a minute.
Under a minute? OK, well, that's longer than I thought. OK, now, I'm not sure that this hasn't got enough attention, but I think that it's going to be one of the defining things of our age. Obviously, there's COVID, there's climate, but inflation. I think that we're at this really interesting point where we're seeing economies roaring back. Jeffrey was talking about 7% growth in the US. You can't have 7% growth whilst you've got interest rates at next to zero for very long. And what's going to be interesting is whether you supercharge these economies' recovery when they've still got monetary policy, the cost of borrowing money, which is more suited to a financial crisis and, of 10 years ago. And at some point, something has to give. There's already signs that, the government, the rate at which governments can borrow money is beginning to go up. That could have big implications for companies and for individuals.
Simon, very succinct. Sadly, we can't inflate the length of the programme. Thank you very much to Isabel, to Simon and to Jeffrey. Thank you all for watching. We're back at the same time next week, wherever you are in the world. Goodbye.